This has been our highest attended and the highest demand course that we've run. So we've run now, this will be our fourth of the past few weeks. And the past few we've had to cap at 500 registrants just due to unprecedented requests and demand. So we're going to try to keep to do as many of these as possible. I also wanted to take a quick moment to recognize the incredible Covetrus organization for helping to continue to support some of these. They've been great partners of ours for years and supporters. And certainly I know many of you are coming through as a direct link through their newsletter that came out. So we appreciate the support, and Emily Blanton as well. Thank you very much. So today's course, today's continuing education course is specific on the business side of the animal practice. And specifically now, as we go through this uncertain terms, COVID-19 is having a dramatic impact through the entire business world, let alone the vet community. Now, luckily, we're seeing a lot of vets continuing to still be able to operate, to still have some strong infectious control procedures, and meeting the animal outside and bringing them right in, etc., and still being able to generate a significant amount of revenue and production. So that is better than many other businesses out there. So really, the purpose of today is to help talk about the current state of affairs, and let's talk about what's working with landlords and how are we dealing with some of our rent and cost obligations. In addition to that, what are some strategies that are working to help to defer and abate rents? And in addition to that, what do we need to be aware of, especially in a COVID-19 environment? What are the top things that we're advising our clients to look out for, and what to look for in the lease agreement, and what impact that might have, right, to your vet clinic? So my name is Eric Pook. I'm Managing Director here at Cirrus Consulting Group, where we have been very honored to be supporting the vet community now for almost our full 26 years in business, and certainly have done over 12,000 successful negotiations. Just a little bit of housekeeping here. So within the platform, we have a full question and answer section. So the goal of today is to keep things as interactive as possible. We'll have some polling at the end, and to make sure it's all about you and your specific situation. So I'm happy to go through specific questions as we go. This will be recorded and shared. But if you have any individual questions that might be beneficial for the group, please post to the Q&A section. I can see it here, and we can answer it live or directly through the built-in chat. So great, perfect. We appreciate everyone's attendance thus far. So let's jump in, shall we? So a little bit about Cirrus. So very uniquely, we found a large need 26 years ago that vets and doctors were graduating from school without any significant business experience. So we were founded by a group of doctors, for doctors, to help them in the process of securing and being properly represented in the negotiation of their commercial office lease agreements. So because of that, that now gives us 26 years of intellectual property and capital negotiating these type of agreements for vets from all the way from the south of San Diego through Texas, right, through all the way through South Florida, all the way up through the East Coast, through Canada, as well as all the way through Alaska. And we just had a recent one of a new start in Hawaii. So we are really seen. If you Google or ask Siri, how do I open a dental vet practice, we come up as the #1 resource. And that gives us the opportunity to help ensure that as you're opening up the animal hospital, it gives the perspective as to what to look out for, right? What are some common mistakes that get made? And then more importantly, amongst this incredible environment, right? What opportunity does that give to me in my clinic if I'm able to expand, if I'm able to do some investments into my space and to help support? We also work with some prominent vet groups throughout Canada and the US, right? That are in the 5 to 10 to 15 plus range of rooftops that are currently looking for assistance in managing that lease portfolio. So as mentioned, we do lots of these continuing education courses, and we are truly the specialists in this type of healthcare tenant representation. So the purpose of today is focus on a couple of aspects. Number one is principally on where we're at today, right? What are some critical business impact decisions that impact our business today? What do we need to look out for, right? Is it base rent, annual increases? Is it some of the clauses in the lease agreement, such as the default or the right to renew our lease? Is it the ability that if we are, heaven forbid, forced to relocate or be moved out, what term is left on the lease to give us protection in the space? We're going to touch on some of the top things we're asking for with our clients today. We're also going to be looking through where we're at with the climate. And it's funny, it's been a couple of weeks since we've done this course, how much things have changed. And also, unfortunately, how few things have changed. But definitely from the landlord community and negotiating deferrals and rents, as well as for some new starts, in many cases, it's never been a better time. So in addition to that, a lot of the requests we get are, we've got some problems, right? Cash flow has gone down. We're seeing a decrease in the patients and the companion animals that we're seeing today, and we need help with some of the largest expenses. So some of you may have already gone through some layoffs or furloughed some employees. Now the rent becomes the number one expense, right? Yet, isn't it unfair that the landlords are able to get some subsidies or deferment of property taxes or otherwise, yet we still remain to pay our April rent? And now as we go towards May and June, what are some strategies in place to help us protect some cash to make sure that we not only survive, but thrive through this? So in addition, what we'll touch on within the lease is what are some of the financial and non-financial components of the lease we need to be aware of, right? And then what are some landlord strategies that work, right? It still baffles me that as a group, right, very cost conscious as it pertains to buying equipment or buying certain merchandise or otherwise, or staff. Yet when it comes down to the real estate, right, most vets throughout the country will wait until the last minute, wait until the landlord proposes whatever rent they choose, and then at the 11th hour, basically requiring you to pay, give or take, a few cents per square foot or a few dollars per square foot, right? Then require you to sign a long-term lease and renew the lease at whatever rates there are, dramatically increasing your overhead cost. So hopefully at the end of today, you'll have a better appreciation for the importance of the veterinarian office lease, as well as the ability to help ensure that you're smart about your next renewal and how you can leverage the landlords that in many cases are very nervous, and their banks are very nervous about what restaurants and what bars are not able to pay rent, or some gyms have sent letters to landlords stating that we are not charging rent for paying any rent for the next 3 months, and basically thrown themselves to the wolves to have the landlords choose what they want to do with them, let it be default or other provisions through there. So we're going to touch on some of those landlord negotiation strategies. And last but not least, as you may know, from those of you that we've worked with us in the past, is I'm a big glass half full kind of guy. And no different than talking to some of the top leaders at Bank of America or otherwise. Ben Stewart is a great example. We had a good conversation the other day about how Cirrus and Bank of America and others were helping clients in 2008 build out new animal hospitals. And for those doctors that looked through that unbelievable credit crunch and the mortgage debacle, right, and they saw it as an unbelievable time to start their business. So for those of you on the line that started in 2008, 2007, right, beginning of 2009, you got some of the lowest construction rates possible. You were able to renew or negotiate leases, right, at incredible rates. And also financing rates were incredibly low as they were desperately trying to restart the economy. So again, what an amazing opportunity now to be looking at either expanding or to relocating or adding a new satellite point, because overnight we've seen a shift to be seeing that landlords become very, very aggressive to fill those vacant spaces. So let's have some good conversations on that front. Again, for any of the questions and answers, there's a section for those of you logged in through the app. You can ask and answer through there, and happy to answer as we go. So, all right, what's most pertinent? Hopefully you've got a copy of your lease handy with you. So one of the first things that we do as part of our lease review process is we look at what the terms are and what are the financial terms, meaning when did you sign the lease, right? When did the lease commence, right? When did it start? When does the first payment go out? And then when does your lease expire? Now you may say to yourself, well, what does it matter when my lease expires? I'm having cash flow problems today, right? Fair point. However, right, when thinking about it from the landlord's shoes, right, what do they need? What makes them tick? Well, ultimately, it's two things, principally. It's rent and it's term. So when looking at it from the landlord's perspective, right, what increases the value of their building and business is by having all their vacancies filled and in as many people in long-term leases as possible. So for example, right, we're seeing some great success now with doctors who are looking to get some help with short-term deferrals or abatements in rent. In addition to that, to be laying out a strategy to say to the landlords that also I see my leases coming up in the next 2 or 2.5 years. And, you know, this whole COVID thing is causing me to rethink about the growth and the strategy of my business. And what I want to do is submit a proposal now outlining a new 10-year term with 2 5-year options to align to where we're at with my clinic and to help ensure that I've got a long-term lease that is helping, as well as also resetting some of my financials aligned with the current economic climate. So depending on when your lease expires is dramatically different to how your landlord may respond or the leverage you may have with your landlord to negotiate better rates and more favorable terms. The next question is, are there any terms to renew? Right? And that's a big question. I did a lease review with a vet just recently that was in a month-to-month basis. So I did this with my associate, Matthew Donato. This was in Texas, where the doctor had, without knowing it, had gone into a month-to-month lease, started going month-to-month in March. So unfortunately, the doctor, after reviewing and realizing the lease, thought for a second, oh, well, that's good. That gives me less liability. But then at the same point, she realized that she had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to build out that space, right? And the risk that either another vet or another tenant may want to move into that space and see the glass half full as great opportunities put her dramatically at risk that within nothing more than 30 days notice from an envelope attached to her door that she could be out. And then she realized that it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars to build out a new vet clinic, right, around the corner next door, right? And hopefully a new vet wouldn't move into the area that she just left. So for any of you that are on a month-to-month basis, it is critical that you reach out to us as soon as possible to discuss strategy, process, and specifically how we can help. And at the bottom, I've just included our email address at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, where we'll have a look at that lease to determine if you have any questions on any of these components. That's key. But definitely, if you are on a month-to-month basis in these uncertain times, you need long-term rent for predictability and continuity of the practice. So that's important. Another big question we get are, what's my exposure? So Eric, help me understand if, heaven forbid, I miss a payment, what happens? Well, first off, looking through a lot of the blogs and some of the vet groups on Facebook, there's some terrible guidance out there, right? Where some doctors are telling their colleagues to say, you know what, don't pay rent, see what happens. Do not, repeat, do not miss rent, right? That could be exposing yourself up to default and all sorts of other, very, very damaging things to your business and yourself personally, right? Including asking yourself, who is a named tenant? So if you have your lease in front of you, on the very first line of the very first page, it'll define whom the tenant is, meaning who is contractually responsible. It may be in your corporation name, good, or it might be in your name personally, which is a concern that, again, if in the event of any dispute between yourself and the landlord, you, right, and yourself and your personal assets may be personally exposed. So there's lots of strategies and ways to help to mitigate some of that risk that we'll touch on and those personal guarantees. But yes, right, if it is in your name personally, or if you have signed something called a personal guarantee, that, as we've seen the past few weeks, landlords can now ask for your banking records, your personal tax filings last year, and the tax filings of your business, and also the business bank account for any reason, depending on how the lease is structured. So hopefully now I have your attention, considering we're just starting to see and looking at the lease a little differently. So in addition to that, right, what's our financial obligations? So what type of tenant are you? Meaning, are you a gross lease? Is it all included in one flat rate? Or is it a triple net lease? Is it plus, plus, plus? Or is it somewhere in between, such as a modified gross lease? We were talking with a doctor in California recently that the landlord had changed hands. The landlord who bought the building looked at all the leases, realized that within the lease, structurally, they were able to charge for some of the taxes and insurance, and therefore raise the doctor's rent by $8,000 a month and retroactively billed that for the previous 6 months. All because the landlord bought the building, saw an opportunity, wanted the cash, wanted the return, and used this, right? And the fact that the previous landlord just had never billed it, right, became an instant liability. So these are the type of things that you need to be aware of within your lease agreements and what those respond. In terms of deferrals and abatement, so there are ways. Many landlords are open to giving some short-term assistance as it pertains, to base rent. They also may be flexible in deferring some of the common area maintenance rent, or at least decreasing it, considering some of their expenses like property taxes they might not be responsible for incurring. In addition to that, then other aspects, rentable versus usable square feet, all sorts of other elements to be aware of what you're paying for. Again, if you've got any questions, email us now at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. Default. Boy, have we ever had a lot of questions on this. So what is default? Default in basic terms means that you have not fulfilled your end of the bargain, that there's a section of the lease that you have not completed or adhered to. This could be missing a payment. This could be not giving a certain notice within a period of time. This might be not being open continuously from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, right? We had a doctor that emailed us a letter from their landlord. This was end of March, just into the beginning of this COVID crisis. And you know what the landlord wrote in the letter? Said, sorry to hear about your troubles. We notice you've been closed, and per your lease agreement, you are required to stay open regardless. And therefore, we are finding you in the material default, and here's all the terrible things we're going to do. Right? So these landlords, and many landlords, are very enterprising or opportunistic. And if they want to get that doctor out or you out of that space, what a great opportunity to try to find some loopholes in the lease, right? Such as the continuous operation, right? Notwithstanding ethics or legalities or otherwise, this is what's happening. And it's becoming a problem that, again, is easily avoided depending on how your lease is structured. But to be clear, right, if you were ever to be deemed in default, the next question is, does the landlord have to notify you, right? Is there a cure or remedy period? For many of you on the line, your leases, it might be silent, meaning that you might be in breach of your lease agreement today and not even know it. So what does that mean? That means that when you go to exercise your option to renew your lease at the end of the term for another 5 or 10 years, etc., right? They might write back, as we've seen some examples recently, where they say, no, we found you in material breach, and therefore your options to renew the lease have become null and void, and you'll be required to be out, right? July 31st of 2020 at the end of your term of your lease, right? These are some major things that can be hiding in your lease that you need to be aware of and need to make sure that, again, you've reviewed it or have it professionally reviewed. Another one is, does the landlord have a termination right? Meaning that if you are in default, can they send you a termination notice that they're done and you're out? So some other key things here in terms of general terms and conditions. When we touch on personal guarantee, as we mentioned before, or exclusivity, right? Do we have or do we lose the ability to stay exclusive as the only general dentist and general vet in the space, right? Or can Petco or someone else open up and build a competing service, right? What is in the use provision from there? Also, what happens if our landlord goes bankrupt, right? Is there any specific impact on that front? And what happens, and do we need a non-disturbance or subordination agreement to help make sure that your lease for the animal hospital is subordinate to the mortgage? And last but not least, when you go to sell, right, you found a new vet at a school that's looking to buy your practice, who's been an associate for a few years, right? Do you lose the ability to sell your clinic if you are unable to, if you've been found in default, or, right, if you are unable to sell the practice due to the assignment and subletting clause? So really just to summarize about what we're seeing today and where we're at. So first of all, you're right. We are in unprecedented times. We are what we're calling phase one of this nightmare, where many clinics are still open, right, which is great. Some are obviously on reduced hours. Some are able to still keep many of their staff on. That is fantastic, right? The vet business is doing better than many other professional services firms, right? But what does that mean for us? That actually gives us the best of both worlds. It gives us the fact that with our leases and our landlord gives us great leverage because of the macroeconomic conditions, as well as it still allows us to make sure that we're earning and producing revenue and being smart about continually making sure that our business is staying out of harm's way. So what do we see? Well, we see now that we're in phase one, where a lot of people are in lockdown and a lot of people aren't wanting to bring their companion animal to the vet unless absolutely necessary, right? And then if so, what we're gonna see is then a phase two. Now the date, your guess is as good as mine. However, I believe on the positive that we're gonna see a bit of a super cycle where people might be avoiding some of the more electives, but as soon as we're able to get back into our cars and back into bringing our animals in, right, we will see a dramatic uptick in production and schedules being filled. So the question now is, do you want to be a part of the group that is most capitalizing on that for growth, right, and taking advantage of new opportunities or new locations or expansions, right, or do we want to be passive? Right? I can assure you there will be shakeup in the vet space and there will be lots of acquisitions and changes. The question is, do you see this as an opportunity? And if so, what can you do today to help structure towards that? Right? And no different than September 11th or 2008 and now 2020, right? This can yield an incredible opportunity to build and grow and scale your business, right? And take advantage of where we're at today. So this is always important. We talk about this in all our RACE certified courses where we help to frame what is the lease. So if we asked ourselves, what is the lease today? Right? We went around the room, and you can put that in the question and answer sections, is what is the lease? Well, it's a contract. It's a fee. It's an agreement, right? It's typically what we find. However, what few vets look at it as is a check, right? And I just got off a phone with a vet that's in the just outside of Manhattan, who now is looking to sign a lease that is going to represent, for a new clinic, that is going to represent over $1.4 million for a beautiful large clinic, specifically just in base rent, not even included common area maintenance. So doctors, let me ask you a question. If you knew that this lease agreement was going to be your largest expense to any single entity in your personal or financial lives, would you have negotiated it a little differently? Would you have required that the lease to be not just landlord friendly, but also very tenant friendly as well, right? And if so, then there's no better time like the present, because the lease represents a check, right? And it's so unfortunate that most vets just focus on the first half of the first page: base rent, annual increase, who's responsible for the check payments, and so on. Right? But it represents a massive check, and it is, and I can't tell you, so many vets throughout the country feel that because they're profitable and successful, they almost feel that it's their penalty to pay these high rental prices, right? And it's their duty to pay their landlords more because they feel that the location has been one of their main aspects of success. Please, doctors, starting today, realize that you represent one of the best possible tenants on the planet, right? So again, why is it so important to you? Because your location is your business is your location, right? Envision driving into the practice tomorrow, right? You've got a handful of emergency patients and surgeries, and before you know it, you see an envelope on the door that states that, right, in 30 days notice you're out. What would you do? Who would you call, right? So from that perspective, very important that we're structuring things from the perspective of strength. So how do we help to protect and save ourselves? How do we help to make sure that we don't miss a payment? Because if we do, right, that could be catastrophic with default, right? The build outs, it can easily be $100, $150 per square foot to build out the clinic. And therefore, right, to relocate the practice could be devastating and need a large loan. In addition to that, very expensive, very time consuming to move, right? And of course, if we're going to sell or we're just ready to hang up our coat and walk away, right? Can we, right? Or even worse, for many of you, you may have to return it to pre-vet condition. So from that perspective, ultimately, it gives you leverage, and it can help to make sure that you're here for the long run. And better than any, nail salon or barber shop or Subway sandwich shop, right? You represent an incredible tenant, right? That, again, is bringing in high quality foot traffic and a great resource. So in addition to that, a couple of points here is, first of all, what should your lease do for you? So if we could wave the magic wand, what would we want it to do? Well, a couple of components. First and foremost is to provide fair and affordable financial terms. Right? How do we help to make sure that of the 7 main negotiables, how do we help to make sure we're getting the best possible rate? Number 1, base rent. Number 2, annual increases. Number 3, if we're building at a space, what's the fixturing period? Right? We should have multiple months, upwards of 6 months, to help negotiate the lease in a straightforward process to be able to build out the practice without having to pay base rent. In addition to that, there should be some free rent. So after the lease has started, to be able to get usually 2 or 3 months of free rent, not additional rent to the tacked on to the end of your term, right? But actual free rent to help from a cash flow perspective. There's also things like a tenant improvement allowance, money from the landlord to help build out your space. In addition to that, there's all sorts of ways of landlord work, right? Or helping to reduce or limit the common area maintenance. So a lot of aspects here to help ensure that you're getting a fair deal or renegotiating to fair rates. We did one recently in Vista, California. We were able to negotiate the doctor's lease down by 40%, 40%. She gave us a great 5-star review, right? Why was that possible? Because the doctor had just agreed to whatever base rent that was coming through, right? And was just renewing their leases without doing any significant negotiations or having anyone helping them. You should also make sure you have long-term stability and security, usually a 10-year term with 2 5-year options. Our advice is usually don't exercise your option, meaning negotiate a new lease prior to that option to renew deadline. So before you're required to sign on the dotted line and to, say that you're agreeing to everything in the lease with the exception of rent, best to start the negotiations 2 years prior to minimize, to give you that long-term stability and security and maximize your leverage. If you wait until the last few months or the last month before your lease expires, right, you've just fallen into the landlord's trap, and they've just found a way to increase their profit and revenue, right, without increasing their costs at all. So in addition to that, right, minimizing risk and exposure. So we are in unprecedented times, and unfortunately, the mortality rate is increasing and high. So heaven forbid something happens to you or your ability to run the animal clinic. You need to make sure and require that in your lease, you have something called a death and disability clause. This is something we pioneered over 26 years ago to help the vet community in and to minimize their total exposure and to help give them the ability or their estate to terminate their lease with as little as 60 days notice, right? So in essence, it helps to protect you. There was a doctor north of our office who was 43 years of age, built a beautiful clinic, and 3 weeks prior to the grand opening had died of a massive heart attack. Now the estate, right, and the wife had no involvement with the practice whatsoever, but was now dealing with the bank, right, who wanted to collect all of that loan money on the life insurance. And then unfortunately, the landlord said, very sorry to hear about that, but per the lease, it is binding to the successors or heirs, and the estate now is responsible for the $9,000 a month, increasing at 3% per year over the next 9.5 years. So you have a fully built out clinic, no doctor, right? No patients, no charts. What's that clinic worth? Unfortunately, nothing. In this case, less than nothing. So the reason why we get so passionate about this is to ensure that doctors, you're protected. You owe it to yourself, your family, your staff to make sure that that lease agreement that you might have signed with all good intentions, and you might have had a great broker otherwise that said it was a great deal, but how do you know what's in your lease and when was the last time you reviewed it, and how to help to make sure that you are understanding and protecting yourself. So let's touch on cash flow. So part 2 now, let's touch on some of the main components. We touched on base rent. Common area maintenance is another one. So as we go through the challenging times now, there might be some opportunity that we can reduce their common area maintenance. So by being able to protect yourself by adding some limits. So in the next lease renewal, or depending on how your lease is structured, you might be able to reset your base year in terms of what incremental fees that the landlord's incurring, what they're being passed on to you is number one. Number 2 is operating expenses and triple nets. So now as we're looking forward, right, what are some ways that we can do to help reduce, delay, or defer those common area maintenance, or potentially put on something called a common area maintenance cap, or amortize those fees over a certain period of time to make sure that we're not hit with any surprises. Let's say the landlord is now going out, or we reopen in a few months, and they have to triple or quadruple, right, their cleaning staff and the cleaning chemicals or otherwise. That could dramatically be increasing what those fees that you're required to pay. So it's important to be aware of, and aware, especially if your lease is coming up for renewal. Another little tidbit is that for those of you that have built out a clinic recently, the landlord may have given you a tenant improvement allowance, and that's money from the landlord to build out your new clinic. For those of you that might have been paid over multiple tranches, there's been some that have forgotten about the third tranche. So if they promised you $40,000 or $10,000, there might be a few $1,000s outstanding that the landlord owes you, depending on what you negotiated for in your lease. Can't stress enough, don't stop paying rent, right? Best to start negotiating a strategy now for a lease deferral or lease abatement to make sure that before we run into the cash crunch, we've protected ourselves. Because if not, you could be deemed with accelerated rent. You could be forced to pay multiple months of a higher security deposit. You could also lose your benefits of exclusivity, option to renew, etc. So other key elements here, as we touched on, are let it be asking for financial statements or termination rights, right? And let's touch on the non-financial. So this is another important aspect. So first and foremost, the force majeure. Force majeure is unfortunately not what everyone hopes it would be. Force majeure, in essence, talks about an unforeseeable event or unforeseeable circumstances that can prevent someone from fulfilling the contract. It could be an act of God, it could be a riot, it could be all sorts of other elements. However, what it boils down to is it's typically relief, mostly for the landlord, from the performance of having to complete the performance of the lease agreement, which means that they may be able to restrict space, they may be able to do other things. But unfortunately, it's not always and rarely tenant friendly, depending on how you negotiated the lease. So it also almost always doesn't give you the relief to stop paying rent. So even though we're going through all this pandemic, right, unfortunately, we are still required to pay rent. Now, happy to review and do a double check, but ultimately that's what we're seeing across the board. It is very landlord friendly. And of course, I'm sure the lawyers for years will be in specific conversations and back and forths about how it will be defined and what will be included moving forward. So again, from that perspective, we touched on force majeure, other impacting clauses. So I want to spend some time here. This is, again, for those of you that are watching through on your smartphones or otherwise, this is a great one to take a little screenshot of, because what it shows here is a couple of things. First of all, many of which that could be very detrimental to us today or as we start to reemerge from this. So the assignment section of the lease is probably one of the first ones you should review. For those of you contemplating either selling your practice or potentially bringing on an associate to work with you, this is very relevant. So for example, it dictates if and how you're able to sell your clinic, right? In many cases, in your leases, over 90% of you on the line will be continually liable, meaning even after you sell your clinic, you are still responsible financially for the new doctor. Right? And we've seen multiple examples where the clinic was sold, right? The new vet takes over, goes through hard times, gets into a default, right? Walks away from the practice, and the original doctor is still continually and personally liable. Can you imagine working your entire career, sell your practice for a fair, right, but not obscene rate, fair rate, right? Only to now be sold and being told now that, right, have some sleepless nights because you're still personally and continually liable for the new doctor for the balance of the 10-year term and any options at that time. So the assignment section can be very, very relevant. And if you are looking to sell your clinic in the next few years based on COVID, right, we've got a problem and we need to be smart about how we're going to structure that, because the landlords are going to be very, very, very focused and determined to help make sure that their interests as the landlord are protected. Demolition rights and relocations, another big one. We've had conversations with property developers out there that see this as one of the best opportunities to be gobbling up the real estate or strip malls they've been eyeing for years, right? That they can gobble these up for, in some cases, pennies on the dollar, right? As some smaller landlords are heavily leveraged and running into financial difficulty. So if you do have a demolition clause in your space, or the landlord has the right to relocate your animal hospital, then we need to be smart about how we limit the landlord's ability to do that, because that could obviously be devastating. And on top of the lack of revenue through these months, we could now be really dealing with a double whammy and being forced to relocate our practice or no longer being able to stay if in the event a developer acquires your building and redevelops it. Death and disability, we touched on the surrender clause. Some of you may be towards the end of your term and you might be so frustrated and disappointed with the current state of affairs that you just want to take the keys and just throw it into the ocean. Right? Well, I've heard that one. Unfortunately, for many of you, it might not be that easy. At the end of the term, check in your lease for a surrender clause or a restoration. What that means is that might require you to, whatever it looked like when you built out your practice, or if you acquired it, what it looked like when they built out their practice, gives them the full responsibility to you to incur all the costs to return it to pre-vet condition. So if it was a gray shell when you moved in, it might be your responsibility to return it back to and demolish it back to that base shell condition. Why? Because if the landlord has a new tenant that wants to take over and use it for a medical or dental or optometrist, the landlord doesn't want to pay for it. And if you're contractually obligated, that could be another $10,000 or $15,000 to return your space to pre-vet condition. Again, if you're month to month today, please make sure in the poll at the end, click that your situation is urgent and you need immediate help, because in the overholding section, you may be responsible for paying upwards of 125, 150, or 200% of the base rent. And you may also be required to go back and pay retroactively for that increased rent, just for the flexibility of being month to month. Right? So again, you never want to be outside of term. The best leverage you have is to negotiate that long-term lease with multiple options. Personal guarantees, again, can't stress enough. Make sure, doctors, that if you do have a personal guarantee and you've made your rent payments on time and you've been a good tenant, right? It's a perfect opportunity when your lease comes up for renewal in the next year or 2 years, etc. What an amazing time to be renegotiating that, be professionally represented, and understand how to get this either removed or limited to make sure that you are not continually and personally liable, nor access to all your personal financial statements. Quiet possession, non-disturbance, subordination. Again, if the landlord goes bankrupt, a lot of things here that, again, we need to make sure we're aware of. Exclusivity. Right? We might lose the ability to be the only vet in the space, right? We might lose our ability to sell some of the merchandise or prescriptions or otherwise, depending on what a Petco or another type of organization might be negotiating in their leases, as well as termination rights as well. So there's a lot of things specifically to be aware of. So what's working today? Well, first off, ask yourself the question, when does my lease expire, right? And what leverage might I have with the landlord to help make sure that of the dozens and dozens of phone calls they're getting each day from other tenants that cannot pay their rent, right? What can we do to differentiate ourselves as a successful doctor with a profitable practice that's here for the long run, right? So again, if your lease is expiring within the next 2 years, it gives you that much more leverage to help negotiate deferrals or abatements. So let's touch on rent relief. So rent relief can come in a wide variety of ways. We've seen some great success with some landlords open to saying, look, let's defer April, meaning move it from April 1st, and let's move it to the end of the term, a year from now, 6 months from now, 2 years from now, basically adding it on to the end. That is fantastic, right? That gives us extra cash flow, renew the lease anyway, so what's an extra month at the end? That is a great piece that we've been able to structure and make sure it's captured properly into a lease amending agreement. In addition to that, deferrals or abatements. So perhaps we cut rent in half and decrease the rent in half for the next few months, and then spread that out over the next 6 or 12 months, ideally without any interest. So there's a number of ways now that, depending on the landlord, depending on the size of the landlord, typically the larger landlords have more reserves and therefore are more flexible to these type of situations. Some of the mom and pops, right, that are, wanted to get and become a landlord, unfortunately now are feeling the pain of that, where now many of the tenants are not able to pay rent and the landlords have to make their mortgage payments. So they've caught themselves very lean and they might not have the flexibility to give you a month or two off in rent. So again, depends on the situation. Common area maintenance and additional rent we touched on. How do we help to reduce the CAM fees, right? How do we ask for it? First off, have a strategy, right? And be smart and be early, right? And to help make sure that you've got a strategy first, right? So what we're doing, we'll touch on, is that for those, again, in appreciation of your time, we're going to do a complimentary lease review and we'll help to give the strategy. But please, if the landlord just says, you know what, don't worry about May's rent, right? And it's the property manager, it's not even the landlord, you've got a problem, because that has to be documented. Don't put yourself in harm's way by not paying rent. All right, so when and how? So this is probably one of the biggest takeaways. This is how landlords learn how to negotiate against the veterinarian. What this states here is the lease cycle. So if your lease comes due every 5 years, right, the best time to you for the most negotiation and leverage is to start negotiating 12 to 24 months prior to the lease expiring. The more time, the better. Landlords know it can be upwards of 18 months to relocate a vet practice. They know that. So you reach out 24 months in advance, and what is the landlord going to do? They're going to defer. Oh, you know what? It's too soon. It's delayed, right? It's not a good time. Come see me in a year. A year rolls around. You reach out. Oh, no, we're busy. It's too soon. We're not too sure what rents are going to be. Come back in 6 months from now, right? At 6 months, that's the date that you have to give written notice that you want to extend your options, right? At that point, the landlord might not even remind you. Most likely won't. And therefore, if you miss that, your remaining 2 5-year options or 5-year options will become null and void. That's a problem because now you have no further rights to stay in the space, right? And you now have a significant amount of risk because there's no right to stay in the space after your lease expires in that next 6 months. So that is critically important to start the process early. So, and what does Cirrus do? We get that question a lot. What does Cirrus do differently? Well, first off, we help to draft and outline a proposal. Let's put the landlord back on their heels. Let's put a proposal up to show what a new 10-year term and 2 5-year options would look like. Let's outline the financial terms, base rent, annual increases, all based on local real estate data. And also let's go through all the other principal business and legal clauses in the lease and identify which ones might be concerning and onerous and what do we want to improve, right? So by doing that and taking a proactive approach is how we get the results and what we have done for 26 years. So to summarize on that opportunity, lease renewals, it is an unprecedented time to be negotiating with landlords who are nervous, who are very anxiously looking to adhere to their banks, shareholders, etc., to give a long-term lease renewal, right? To help make sure, because the landlord, if you renew your lease for another 10 years, think about it, right? Their books and their revenue can then recognize 10 years worth of additional receivables and revenue. That's a great thing for the landlord. So use that to your advantage. For the new starts, for the many vets that have reached out to us, right, or many of the territory managers that Covetrus has throughout the country, what an incredible time. Anybody that's thought about branching out, relocating, or looking at a new practice, what a great way of looking at it now and looking for the great deals out there, right? Landlords desperate to find and fill vacancies, a lot of flexibility on some of the financials. It is an amazing time. Financing, I mean, the Fed rate right now, we're as close to zero as we've ever been. It's never been a better time to take a loan, right? The equipment and supplies, right? If you're looking to equip a new office right now, I can assure you many of the manufacturers are offering all sorts of incentives right now to continue their revenue stream as they move forward, both on the equipment and supply side, right? And in addition, landlords. Right? Landlords now are very happy to be receiving proposals or letter of intents to help properly structure and to help make sure that we have, prominent doctors moving into their spaces versus the, bubble tea or, other tenants that, might be going through a challenging time right now. So in the essence of time, here's one clause. And I wanted to highlight this for a few reasons because it can be relevant to you. So first and foremost, just to renew your lease, this is the clause that dictates if and how you renew your lease. As you can see here, it's personal to the original doctor, right? And is not transferable. So if you're looking to sell your practice to Dr. Jim Smith, right? Dr. Smith cannot get a loan from the bank without sufficient term on the lease. So therefore, if you think you have 10 years left of loan or a lease term, you don't. If it is personal to you and the new doctor is coming in as a new tenant, right? They only have the balance of the lease if the landlord chooses to assign it. In addition to that, if they're not in default. So again, that one missed payment in April, hopefully there wasn't, but if there was a missed payment, that might leave you heavily exposed and to no longer be able to renew the lease, right, by being held in default. Also, don't miss your option to renew deadline. Please, if you have your lease in front of you, put in your smartphone when does the lease expire and when does the option to renew deadline must be submitted. Typically 6, 9, or 12 months prior to expiry. Very important you're aware of those, right? Also, the landlord can rewrite the lease and put you on a standard form lease, right? And for many of you, your lease keeps going up. So when you renew your lease, it continues to increase year over year, renewal after renewal. It's like you're on the world's most boring roller coaster. It's only going in one direction. It only goes up. You should be able to, if your lease is coming up, right? And you're in your lease agreement today, it states that your rent will only go in one direction. Well, now we have to renegotiate because the economics in the world have changed. You shouldn't be forced to pay more just because, right? And other core aspects. So here's just one clause that could have hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're forced to relocate, if you have to absorb an increase in rent, right? Or if you're unable to sell your practice, right? It could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So to summarize, before we get to some Q&As, and last time we had almost 20 minutes worth of Q&As, what works? So we've pioneered over 26 years and doing this now over 12,000 times to structure a winning plan. The first thing I can advise all of you is to get a copy of your lease and get an executed copy. If you don't have one, immediately email the landlord very easily, right? That'll be loan applications, everything that's going on, looking at your lease. They're getting requests all day for an executed copy of the lease. What is your original lease? If you bought the practice, what's that original governing lease? Trust me, they have a copy. Get a digital copy and make sure it's countersigned. If you only have a copy that you signed and you've never received one from your landlord, then technically they haven't agreed to that lease term. You must ensure that you have a countersigned copy. If it's only signed by you, it's not worth the paper it's written on, right? So that's number one, get all your information first. Then take the time. What do you want with the clinic? What are your goals? What's the growth goals? Do you want to bring on an associate? When do you want to transition, right? What does that look like first? And then have your lease professionally reviewed. If it's painful and you get a headache after reading the first 5 pages, you're not alone, right? I oddly enjoy reading leases, but you definitely want to understand what's in it and what the risks are. That's the first step, just educating yourself. Number 4 is get the data, right? We have access to 95 billion square feet, right, that we're tracking and looking at through the commercial intelligence we have access to, right? And then before we do anything else, number 5 is determine the outcome and strategy for development. So let's determine what we want to get. What's the end goal first? Now, doctors, what have we not done yet? We have yet to pick up the phone and call the landlord. However, what is the biggest mistake that people make today? Right? The doctor says, geez, you know what? I've got a lease problem. What am I going to do? I'm going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call the landlord, right? And skips step 1 through 5. And before they know it, the landlord's walking them down the path, right? And all they do all day is just negotiate leases. That's it, right? They don't see animals. They don't do anything like that. They are purely responsible for negotiating leases. So again, you want to make sure that you've got a core plan. You want to make sure you've got help, you've got the knowledge. And then what do, right? Our team then negotiates all the business and financial clauses, right? And then goes through negotiating all the additional terms and conditions in the lease, right? Which can easily be 20 or 30 plus hours, right? Over the span of 60, 90, 6 months, a year, depending on the landlord, right? But we don't stop until we get to a final form lease agreement you're happy with, right? And that, again, ensures that you not only have a fair lease, right, but one that is aligned to your goals and helps to protect yourself and leverages the fact that you're spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, right, to your landlord. You deserve a better deal. So again, for those of you in appreciation for your time, we're happy to send you your real estate report and pull a building summary report touching on vacancies, rental rates, etc. So feel free to email us and we'll have info on that shortly. For those of you that are looking to open a practice in the near term, this is a great little cheat sheet checklist that goes between doctor, lease negotiator, right, equipment provider, lawyer, right, insurance provider, financial institution. It's a great reference guide to ensure that here's who you need and when. And a lot of doctors use us to help specifically set up, right, that them up with their professional team. So last but not least here, what we'll do for all of you today in appreciation for your time is doing a complimentary lease review. So we will spend a considerable amount, 3 to 4 hours, helping to analyze your lease, right, discussing a plan, getting on a call with you to help ensure that you are getting a fair rent, that your terms and conditions you're aware of, helping to limit some of your personal liabilities, and will help to negotiate a bit of a negotiation treatment plan, right, from start to finish. So we appreciate everyone's time. I'm happy to open up the question and answers, and we'll put up a poll here momentarily where you'll see all my contact information. I would encourage you to email info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. And again, for those of you on the line, please fill out the quick poll. Are you currently with a lease today? If so, when does your current lease expire? If your situation is urgent, please denote yes, we will prioritize those lease reviews. We have had hundreds over the past few weeks. Right? And then in addition to that, do you plan to start or buy a new practice within the next 24 months? So from all of this, very important that we look strategically at the future, we look at what's going on in the world, and we look at how we can help to protect ourselves to not only survive through this, but to get through the tail end and thrive as a successful practice. So on that note, I will pause here for additional Q&A. For those of you that haven't, please fill in those last few. You can do it right on your smartphone or on your computers. And we will follow up and coordinate accordingly. And any additional questions? So question here specifically about how and when to reach out to my landlord. So I think the question is about now and rent deferment. So the first piece is the earlier the better, but make sure that you know what your situation is before you engage the landlord. What so many do, as I was just alluding to, just pick up the phone and call, right? But please ensure, when does your lease expire? Do you have options, right? What leverage might you have with a landlord that you can use to your advantage, right? To differentiate yourself versus the other tenants. In addition to that, in terms of when the best time is, right? So if you've just recently bought a practice and you've got 2 years or 4 years left, right? Then, well, first off, the rule book has changed, right? The landlord might be open to securing a new long-term lease. We had a landlord reach out to a doctor recently and stated that the landlord wanted to sell the building and wanted to re-up everyone's leases. So again, a unique opportunity to be involved with the process and also to help make sure that as the landlord's looking to make their books and business look better, what a great opportunity then to take advantage of that olive branch to make sure that your lease is properly structured and protected. So on that note, any other final questions? We've just cleared off the poll. Again, here's all my contact information. Feel free to email or call with any specific requests and for help, and I'd be happy to help out as much as possible. I wanted to again recognize some of our supporters at Emily Blanton at Covetrus. We appreciate all the continual support. And doctors, again, if you have any questions on equipment, let it be merchandise or supplies or otherwise, happy to make the introduction to your local Covetrus representative to make sure that you've got the right resources for opening, expanding, or renovating your current practice. Really appreciate everyone's time. That's us exactly on the hour. I'll happy to stay on if there's any additional questions. But thank you so much for everyone's time, and have a successful and stay happy and healthy. All the best. Thank you, doctors.